This is the DRF Players Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the DRF Players Podcast. This is show 285, the November 14th, 2017 edition. I'm your host, Peter Thomas Fornatel, back with you from the Brooklyn bunker. Looking forward to a very special show today, a little bit different than our usual format. We are going to be talking all about a new book that, in all modesty, I truly believe any horse player should have in his or her collection. We'll get to that in a minute. Joining us, as always, we have calling in from the planet Texas. He's the people's champion. He's Jonathan Kinchin. What's going on, JK?
Well, usually it's just me and you on the show, and then I clearly feel like the smartest person usually on the show when it's just me and you. But there's the occasion where we have people like Paul Matisse, Duke Matisse, and our guest today, Mike Maloney, is going to make me feel like the second smartest person on the show.
There you have it. The cat out of the bag, our third guest, you probably knew already. He's the author of the new book, Betting with an Edge. He's a professional horse player who's been kind enough to lend his time recently to some of the daily racing form handicapping sessions we've been doing for Naira Bets and the Breeders' Cup. He is from Lexington, Kentucky. Mike Maloney. Mike, how are you this morning?
I'm good, Pete. I'm good. Hey, JK, thanks for the smartest guy in the room comment, but I don't know that that's really true. How about we just agree to keep Pete on the bottom of the try?
We'll key him underneath. We'll reverse him underneath.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Enough. I'll take that position when you gentlemen are involved. Mike, we had you here today for mainly to talk about this new book, Betting with an Edge. Before we get into some of the particulars of the content in the book, just so folks know, this is a book that I bothered Mike about writing for conservatively 10 years, maybe a little bit more than that. We first met when Mike was one of the interviews for 6 Secrets of Successful Bettors, a book I worked on with Frank Scattoni long ago. At that point, you were anonymous. You were actually in that book as the Kentucky player, not even as under your own name. That seems to represent quite a change from being in a book pseudonymously to having a book with your name on the title. What changed in that time for you, Mike, and what made you think this was the right time to put this book out there in the world?
Well, to be honest, Pete, if I would have never become involved as heavily as I did in horse player advocacy, I would probably still be anonymous. That my dad used to say that, the lower you fly, the harder it is for them to take a shot at you. So, it's not really my nature to be a self-promoter, but once the pass posting situation at Fairgrounds, which is covered in depth in the book, and me becoming heavily involved in trying to get some things that I saw in racing that I knew were wrong, that I knew hurt players, that I knew hurt the game in general. I worked hard to try to get as much of that changed and addressed as I could. And, to do that, I had to speak to a lot of industry organizations. I did some things on TVG to try to, make people aware of some problems with the tote system and so forth. So, it kind of blew my cover at that point. So now, it made it easier to do this book because, the anonymity was gone. And, so it's easier to come on shows like this, which I love this show, by the way. So I'm excited to be here and excited to be part of it today.
Well, flattery will get you everywhere, Mike. So thank you for saying that, and we definitely appreciate it. Content-wise, it seems like some of the stuff when we were working on the book, you enjoyed talking about and revising the most were things that had to do with your dad, who you mentioned in that previous answer. He's obviously a central figure in the book. Do you think it's correct, as I say in the foreword, correct to say that in some ways it's as much his book and represents his legacy as a horse player as it does yours?
Absolutely, Pete, because what Dad did for me, aside from, from being a great dad and one of my best friends throughout my life. But one of the things he did for me was he didn't have all the answers about racing and handicapping and betting, but he kept me from going down some dark alleys and dead ends that led nowhere. He had done enough work, and he was thoughtful enough that he would save me the time of chasing some of these ideas that might have made sense to me at some point, and that were still bandied about at the racetrack as having validity, but he had figured out that they didn't, and he saved me, a lot of time in that, by not chasing those. And he was invaluable to me just by, he was a guy that wanted to play the horses every day, that took me to the racetrack, and I learned a lot just by observation, just by watching what he and his group of friends who loved the track as much as he did, what they did every day, the mistakes they made, and the things I saw that were, that I thought, hey, that really works. So, I learned a lot just by watching.
Mike, Pete, this is kind of both of you guys. Like I was lucky enough to read significant parts of the book. I've talked about it on the show that one of my favorite parts of the book is just kind of the bankroll management, life management portion of being a horse player. When you guys were doing it, when you guys were doing your interviews to do the show, to do the book, what took up a majority of the time? Mike's amazing stories that are all over the book, or is it more the X's and O's of the handicapping part of it?
That's a good question. What do you think, Mike?
I'd say it was about equal. The X's and the O's were more tedious, JK, to be honest. You have to get the terminology right. And a lot of what I do, I've been doing it so long, I found out through Pete and through our work together for the book that I didn't really have terminology for some of it. It was just in my head. It was just a process that I went through, and I didn't really need terminology because they were my techniques and they were my ideas, and I didn't have to relate them or teach them to anyone. So that was one of the harder things, was to re-examine exactly what I do and, try to come up with terms and explanations so that it would people, that the readers could understand exactly the points that I was trying to make.
And I think that's a good point about sometimes, Mike, I don't even think you knew it was so intuitive, you didn't even know what needed to be fully explained. And then some of that stuff, I feel like I was able to be a sounding board and pull some ideas out of you, but also thanks to some early readers, JK. And then I also want to give a very specific shout out to a friend of the podcast, Sean Borman. Sean, who's worked with you, is sort of out on his own now, but worked with you for years. He read it over and would say something like, why isn't the tuck rule in here? Where's the tuck rule? And I'd call you. I'd be like, Mike, what the heck is the tuck rule? What does John Gruden have to do and Tom Brady with all this?
Yeah. And Sean was invaluable in the process, and Sean's a great friend, and Sean's a tremendous handicapper and a tremendous horse player overall. A lot of the things that you made me aware of, but you were the perfect sounding board, because I could throw out idea after idea, and here's the way I do this, and here's the way I do that, and I didn't really know if it would make sense, if that was easily understood by the average reader, or if that even would make sense to the average reader, if that was a good explanation. So that was, you were invaluable in so many ways, but especially in that way, because, you were my audience throughout that whole process, and you were, your understanding of the game and understanding of handicapping. I mean, I took the bottom of the try shot at you at the beginning of the podcast already, but, I you and I have known each other for a while, but we never got to spend a lot of time together until we started the process of writing the book. And, I was just amazed at how deep and thorough your knowledge of racing was. And, it made it was just fantastic for me. I looked so forward to the hours we spent on the phone going over sometimes the most arcane handicapping ideas, for hours. So, but it, I think it paid off in the end because you took the raw ideas that I had and helped me refine those down to something that's understandable from the reader's standpoint, and something that's functional for them, something that they can read, and they may choose to actually incorporate part of that in their day-to-day horseplay, which is what the book's all about.
Well, I'm just glad to say, Mike, that my obsessive nerdiness about handicapping and reading 30-year-old and 40-year-old handicapping books in my spare time as part of my hobby paid off for something. Thanks for the kind words.
Guys,
Pete, I would tell. I got married in August, and my wife and I were dating, Laura, and during the whole process of the book, and taking some time away from her at certain times, but she was very supportive. But we would call my 2, 3, 4 hour phone conversations with you my therapy session, and that's really what they felt like, because I would just get out, especially when we got into some of the advocacy, some of the problems with racing, and some of the this needs to be fixed and that needs to be fixed. I would just feel like I had totally unloaded and felt like I should write you a check for the session after we were done.
Speaking of the book itself, this is kind of a question for both of you guys. What kind of, or whoever wants to take it, kind of walk the listeners through kind of the journey the book takes you through. Because it talks a little bit about how you got started, and then it works its way into some of your ideas of handicapping and things like that, and then also kind of highlight which one of those chapters, like if you got to know that everyone would at least read this one chapter, what's that one chapter that kind of meant the most to you? I guess it could be different for each of you guys.
Why don't you go through that process, Pete, and then I want to comment on the one chapter deal.
I love it. So for me, no secret here, the gold standard in books on this subject, of course, Andy Byer's books. And I think from early on, knowing that Mike felt similarly about those books and the influence they had on him, the idea was to try to blend memoir and instructional in our own way, but in a way that was clearly influenced by Byer. So you'll see in this book going back and forth throughout between chapters that are essentially tales from the track, great racetrack stories, one of which we'll try to have a bonus chapter of which we'll try to have for you a little bit later in the hour here, and then mixing that in with the nuts and bolts. And we didn't want it to be just a handicapping book. We wanted it to be a book about betting. We wanted it to be a book about the mental side of the game. We wanted it to be a book about the very specifics of bet construction. And as we worked on source material, I started to think of it almost like acts in a play. And at first there were 5 of them, and there ended up being so much stuff that in the end we ended up with a 7-act play that I hope effectively captures not just some of the many great stories from Mike's life. And the stories we chose were not just, some of them are just great stories, but we left a lot of great stories on the cutting board. We really tried to use stuff that tied into the lessons in those 7 chapters. And that was really sort of a goal and guiding principle throughout. And then the other thing I want to mention specifically, and we can talk about this next, wanted to talk about not just the nuts and bolts handicapping, but the handicapping stuff that made Mike think in the first place that this was something he could do professionally, and sort of launched him on his career when he went pro. And that was drilling down much more heavily into the interrelationship between trips and biases. And that's something that's unusual in a way about this book, but I think appropriate, that before we get into the X's and O's of handicapping, we talk very specifically about biases and trip handicapping. And I think we'll return to that, but I'm curious, Mike, to see if your answer to that question is similar to mine, and get you to weigh in on the one chapter you wouldn't want people to miss.
Well, you deserve the credit for the layout of the book, and I'm, now that I can see it, hold it in my hand and read through it, you laid it out beautifully, and it flows. I think it flows very well. But that's all, that's all you. The chapter in the book that I'm the proudest of, and that means the most to me, is the advocacy chapter. And I don't mean that to sound self-serving, but there are a lot of us, I'm sure there are a lot of people out there listening right now, that racing is more than a little pastime to us. We love racing. We grew up, it's tied to a lot of emotional things for a lot of us. It's tied to memories of fathers, uncles, family members, good friends we've made at the track. Some of the best guys I've ever met are horse players. It's a great game. It's the greatest gambling game on the planet. And I get very upset sometimes when I see the corporate mentality invade the game to the point where it distorts the game and it keeps the game from being what it really can be. That hurts me, and to be honest, it angers me. So, I felt strongly about speaking out about that, and without getting too far up on my soapbox here, I'm excited about, and hopeful that when it's the last chapter in the book, and when the readers have gone through the handicapping and the angles that we, that I have, I didn't hold things back in this book. I tried to lay it out, the good, the bad, the ugly, the tips, that I can give, the angles that I use every day. I mean, they're in the book. So I tried to lay it all in there. And hopefully when the reader has gone through the other 6 chapters, when they get to the last chapter, they'll still have the interest and the curiosity to read that, and maybe read something in there that you might not really have known, or that will get you thinking about, is this really the direction that racing should go? So that's the most important chapter to me, because it hits me, where I live. It speaks to how we can improve a game that means a tremendous amount to me.
I got to jump right in here and actually ask JK a question. And I didn't plan on talking anymore about the sort of ongoing Breeders' Cup situation, which is still, we compliment the Breeders' Cup tremendously for taking these issues that came up out of this year's betting challenge so seriously, and they're still investigating it. But JK, when you were one of the 11 horse players who put his name on that letter that was sent in, I mean, is that the type of thing you were thinking about, that Mike's describing, about how great a game it is, but how yet there might be steps to make it better?
Yeah, I mean, now that you mentioned it, it was probably indirectly inspired by some of the conversations I've been fortunate enough to have with Mike about some of the things that he's done. He mentioned the pass posting deal, his involvement at the early stages of getting those IRS situations resolved. If we stand back and kind of watch things that are negative, that could negatively influence the game, and we watch them, and we just watch them and hope that others will take care of the problem, we might be sitting here 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now and not have the very thing that we all love so much. So, that was it. I just, you see something you don't think is right, and you have information you think can help get it fixed. And so you come forward with that. And like I've said last week, and I'll say it again, I don't wish any any ill will on anyone. I don't even care if anyone gets disqualified. I just want to get it fixed. And I think that's one of the things that Mike probably was trying to do is with the past posting, and not trying to get anyone in trouble. I just wants to get it fixed moving forward, and try to find a way to kind of protect this game and the integrity of the game, because when the integrity is gone in a gambling game, it's really, really tough to get it back.
You want to piggyback off that thought for a second, Mike, about the importance of integrity to the ongoing health and future of racing?
Well, absolutely. When I hear a young horse player, I have tremendous respect for JK. And when I hear a guy like him that has the following and the respect among the horse player community that he does, talk like that, it puts a little tingle up my spine, JK. And in reference to the BCBC situation, I'm not a seasoned tournament player. I participate sometimes, but not very often, and I don't know all the ins and outs of everything in that world. But my comment would be, I agree 100% with JK's comments. And the only other thing I would say would be that, apparently the Breeders' Cup is taking this seriously, and they're looking at what's gone on, and my hope would be that this is not, whatever they come up with is not a meek effort, that they don't do a half fix. This is very important. This is the time to make it right. So I hope the Breeders' Cup, which, I'm kind of thinking they will, I'm hoping that they do this right, that they make a complete and thorough fix and give us the tournament environment that the players in the game deserve moving forward.
There's one other chapter specifically I want to highlight, because this is something that you wouldn't necessarily know just from reading the book, but I have my fingerprints. How many chapters are there in the book total? It's probably something like 40 between all 7 parts. There's one chapter in the book that I had almost nothing to do with, except in an editorial role, but I didn't really write at all. And perhaps not coincidentally, it's also one of my favorites. And that's the chapter in section 4. It's the last chapter in section 4, which is called Money Management and the Mental Side of the Game. And it's called Gambling and Relationships. Mike, give us a little bit of an overview of what's in that chapter and why it was so important to you that you probably, I'm going to take a guess, you might have spent more time on that than anything else throughout the process, really.
You're absolutely right, Pete. It was a nightmare to write. And, I'll just be honest with you. But I'm proud of it, because I spent a lot of time. I interviewed a lot of horse players, very informally. I don't quote another horse player in the article, but guys that, I refer to as lifers, that I know have been involved in it a long time. And especially those players that I knew had long-standing relationships. I was curious about, how does that work? You see these guys and you see them, when you go to Del Mar or if you go to Saratoga, or, you see them roll into Keeneland, and they seem to have a good relationship, a good personal relationship with their spouse. And I was just curious about how you maintain that, because I know from being a horse player that's not easy. So, I interviewed several of those people. I gave it a lot of thought. I'm lucky enough to have a great wife now. At the time I wrote the book, she was, she was my girlfriend, and I, just drove her crazy with wanting to talk about those things. And it was good for our relationship that I spent that much time going in depth about, relationships, how they're impacted by gambling, how they're impacted by, by the time, all the time that we spend at the track, or we spend, online playing horses or handicapping horses, watching replays, all the things we do. So it's playing horses at a high level, even if you're a weekend warrior, it's a very time-consuming endeavor. So, kids are involved, families, and how do you juggle all that? How do you blend it all together? What are some ways that work for some people? What are the ways that have worked for me? And I talk mostly about my own personal experiences. And, I had a 20-year marriage, and then went through a divorce. And I talk about my relationship. I go back to when, we were dating before that marriage. So, I think there's some things in there that'll make you laugh. There's some things in there that might make you think. So that's my hope. Is just, it's not like I'm Dr. Phil of horse playing. It's just that but because I say in there, age hasn't solved all the riddles of romantic relationships for me, and that's very true. But what I hope is that players will read that chapter, and you may get a little nugget out of there or a little thought that'll help you, in your relationship, or that'll at least make you think. I think sometimes we don't even think things through about how it impacts, our spouses or our significant others until things start to really blow up, until, the pot is really boiling. I think it works a lot better if we're a little more thoughtful, and we're working on these things as we go, and your spouse feels like you're trying to blend everything in your life together, and in return, I think your spouse is more, or your significant other is more willing to acknowledge this thing that you like to do and to give it a little more of a place in your lives.
That idea of sort of conscious living as a horse player is really at the crux of that section of the book. And one thing you do that I don't think, I've read it in other books about gambling, but I don't think I've ever really read it in another book that was sort of geared towards handicapping specifically, and was, the book is overwhelmingly positive. Your love of racing comes through on every page, even when you're being critical of it. But the same section of the book also talks about the dark side of the game. Why did you make the decision? It was more than a decision. Why did you insist, I'm going to say, on including some stories about how this activity that we love isn't for everybody? And why is that stuff in the book?
Well, I did insist, Pete. I'm sure you remember our first conversation when we got serious about writing this book. Is I said, whatever we do, I don't want someone coming in at the end and wiping out the dark side of gambling that I'm trying to point out. And you were 100% supportive of that, and all that stuff stayed in the book. So it's important to me because I've, to put it bluntly, I've seen lives ruined by gambling. And I don't think that should just be glossed over. I think it's easy in racing to put the 1-800 gambling help number, in the back of the program and then forget about it. There are certain people that are wired better for gambling than other people. And the people that are susceptible to addictive behaviors and are more susceptible to gambling addictions and gambling problems in their lives, we need to recognize that that's part of betting on horses. That's part of the racing world. The racing industry is funded by the handle on the races. It's funded by gambling. It's a gambling game. A lot of racing executives don't really like to say that or even admit it, but it's the truth. So when you're encouraging people to gamble, when your very existence of your industry is based on people betting, then it just stands to reason to me that that needs to be addressed. If I'm going to write a book about racing, about betting, about, professional horse playing, about, anything, there are young kids out there, it kept popping in my head that, am I encouraging young kids that aren't wired for this to consider it as a life option? So, I would feel responsible for that. So it's imperative to me, if I'm going to address this, this subject of, here are ways to gain more of an edge at the racetrack. Here are the techniques that a professional horse player that makes his living at the racetrack, here are the techniques that I use to do that. Then it's imperative of me also to lay out the risks that are inherent in that pursuit.
The book is called Betting with an Edge, A Professional Horse Player's Life in Thoroughbred Racing, and the book does touch on every aspect of that life. In the second half of the show, I want to get into some more of the specific content from the book, and I think I'm going to start off. I'm just going to go ahead, Mike, if it's all right with you. I'm going to read my little intro chapter that I wrote here, which I think sets up the story well, and will hopefully get people excited about ordering the book, which you can do via the DRF store. The ebook is going to be on sale via Amazon very soon. I'll be sending out a link from my Twitter @LoomsBoldly that will have the link to buy directly. You can also tweet at me if you're looking for a signed copy of the book. We have a limited number of copies signed by Mike available for sale that you can purchase directly from us if you're having trouble. Once again, @LoomsBoldly on Twitter. Mike, I assume you're looking to build up your Twitter following a little bit with the book publishing. Give your Twitter to the folks.
My Twitter is Silk1900.
Easy.
Kind of a weird handle, but Silk is my nickname from college, because I guess I was always fooled with the races, and somehow that Silk came into that. And
I thought it was because you're just so smooth.
Well, that was the word on the street back then, JK, but that was a long time ago. And the 1900 part is my initials are MCM, and somehow I thought that would be cute, but then nobody knows what I'm talking about, so it really wasn't that cute.
Here it is, the Michael Jordan of horse players. Here's my favorite Mike Maloney story. It involves Sam Bowie, he of the 10-year NBA career hampered by 2 broken legs. Yes, that's Sam Bowie, the man selected before Michael Jordan in the 1984 draft. After his basketball career, Sam moved back to Lexington, where he'd been an All-American at Kentucky. He and Mike became acquainted at a place called The Lodge, the VIP room at the Red Mile, Lexington's harness track, where Sam would go on to own and race many winners. Mike started his career as a professional bettor in The Lodge and quickly became one of the most respected horse players in the world. Sam also liked to bet, and the two men would sometimes be the only players at The Lodge talking horses while watching the action at far-flung places like Calder Racecourse and Delaware Park. They were technically at odds, sometimes playing against each other in the same pools, but as is often the case with horse players, their competition created a bond too. A few years into their friendship, the two were at a party, and Sam introduced Mike to a group of guests as the Michael Jordan of horse players. Mike was incredibly flattered, but the compliment seemed so over the top that he began to wonder if Sam was really making fun of him. He went to him afterward and said, "Come on, Michael Jordan, really?" Sam said, "Hey, man, I played against him and I played against you. I know what I'm talking about here." As soon as you told me that story, Mike, I knew it had to lead off the book.
Well, I fought you not to put it in there because you're making me blush right now. But, Sam is a great guy. He's a good friend and just not a better guy in the world than Sam. But that was over the top, and I realized it was over the top, but it makes for a great story.
Sometimes that's more important than anything else, especially when it comes to kicking off a book like this. JK, I know you had a few other questions for Mike before we walk through some of the specific chapters here.
Yeah, no, I don't want to give anything away for free, but I actually got to hear the story last night again in person. But the Tom Lutz story with Frisian Fire is one of my favorites as well. That's in the book, and I think the readers will definitely enjoy that one.
Yeah, why don't you recap that one? Because I was actually next going to ask you. The book kicks off with pretty much a chapter that is all memoir, talking about Mike getting involved in the game. A lot of great stories in there, but then it cuts directly to track biases. And this story, the Frisian Fire story, I think that's fair game. We don't want to give away too much here, but that's a pretty good one. We didn't prep you that you were going to be telling it, Mike, but I assume you've told it enough that you remember the salient details.
I think I can roll through it, Pete. You did stop me if I go too long because, I tend to ramble. I'm Michael C. Maloney, and the C does not stand for concise. So, stop me if I get out of bounds. But Tom Lute has been a good friend of mine since before he was a racing mogul. Tom ended up being president of Santa Anita, president of the Breeders' Cup. But our friendship was formed on the golf course around Lexington, when he and I were pretty much nobodies back in the day. So Tom's a great guy. Tom is a stand-up guy and has done a lot behind the scenes for racing over the years. And I think the world of Tom. Here's the story: is Tom was president of Vinery Farm in Lexington at this time, and they owned a horse named Frisian Fire, who was a Derby contender. He had won a bunch of the preps in Louisiana at fairgrounds leading into the Derby that year. And Tom and I had communicated all through the spring, about the placement of the horse and how the horse was doing and so forth. And so he ends up in the Derby. Well, I'm having a Derby party, which I have every year at Keeneland. And the first two races, immediately I see that this is a tremendously strong rail. And the track was a sea of mud. So it's very hard. A lot of times the track maintenance people can address a bias when it's that extreme on a big day. But with the track that wet, it was going to be hard for them to do anything about the bias. So I was confident that the bias would probably stay in effect throughout the race card. So even though I know Tom is crazy busy running a horse on Derby Day, I put in a call to him. Well, in a few minutes, I get the call back, and everybody knows cell phone communication is kind of tough on Derby Day once the crowd gets in there. But we finally get hooked up. The trainer of Frisian Fire was Larry Jones, who I'd had a horse with. He had trained for me a few years before that, and I'd got to know Larry, and I knew Larry didn't really believe much in track bias. He didn't put much faith in that. We had that discussion a couple of times with the horse that he trained for me. So I was concerned about that, but I told Tom anyway that this is a golden rail. Whoever spends the most time on the rail in the Kentucky Derby is going to win it. So it is not necessarily going to be the best horse this year. So Frisian Fire had the 6 pole, and Gabriel Saez was riding. There were several horses inside of him that didn't have any speed. So I told Tom, the way I see the race, you can get in front of maybe all of the horses that are inside of you. And, you could possibly make the lead, but I'm not really advocating making the lead. I just think you can come over and establish rail position very early in the race, probably down the run down the stretch the first time. So if you'll get Saez to do that, give him the strongest instructions you can, just go immediately to the rail and do not leave it. Just stay there and it'll pan out for you. So those were the instructions. Tom said, Larry's on board. He calls me back. Everything's good. That's what we're going to tell Saez in the paddock. So the race starts, and Saez, it just breaks beautifully, comes over to the rail. They go into the first turn of the Derby, and there he is on the rail. And it kind of dawns on me at that point, I just gave the instructions to the rider he's actually the betting favorite in the Kentucky Derby, my rear end is kind of on the line here. So, I get a little nervous. Well, about that time, Saez just makes a right turn. He looks over his right shoulder, his outside shoulder, and just steers the horse inexplicably outside. And not just a couple of passes off the rail, but way out in the middle of the track, like he thought we meant to stay on the outside rail rather than the inside rail. And, so I know my tickets are worthless at that point. And then, of course, Calvin Burrell runs Mind That Bird and makes history using that path to win the Derby. So Tom Luke loves to tell that story of me, and I love to tell him I tried to win him a Derby, but he couldn't get his part done.
The spot made famous when Calvin took it the minute Gabe Saez decided he didn't want it. That's amazing. Right. Riders and bias, that's a very connected idea for you, I know, Mike. Whereas there are some horse players who almost proudly will talk about how they don't pay attention even to who's riding until they look down in the program after the gates are open. Jockeys take a little bit more of a role in your handicapping. Why is that?
Well, it kind of developed, Pete, when I started to do more trip handicapping. When I started out, I didn't trip races like I do now. I tried to pay attention to horses that got in trouble, but I didn't really put down the path that each horse followed throughout the race and how hard they were sent out of the gate and different things like that. But I didn't have the understanding of the jockeys that I have now. And I think the main reason is that when you're tripping races, and by that I mean just putting the pass and the position and is the horse in a good spot or is it not in a good spot? I borrowed short-term notations from Andy Byers, one of his early books that addressed trip notes and tripping races, and to kind of develop my own style for doing that, mostly based on Byers' ideas. And I've added some of my own notations and, that's evolved through the years for me to where I think I'm very good at it. Once I started doing that, I would notice, it was almost impossible not to notice, that certain riders tended to do certain things, that they were, like most of us, creatures of habit. Now, there's some riders that, they're unpredictable, but most riders have styles, and they will repeat the rides in similar situations. They tend to do the same thing in the same situation. So when you understand that, and it's not that you're really studying that, just the process of making the trip notes will show you that. It'll just be right in front of your face. So once I began to understand that certain riders do certain things, I started to look for that. So that works very well in practice when you have a guy that tends to dive to the rail. Burrell, being a famous example of that. In Kentucky racing, Lannery is an example of it. Robbie Alvarado will do it in turf racing. And in dirt racing sometimes too. And then other riders are allergic to the rail. It doesn't matter, what the situation is. They just really don't like being there. So it's a kind of last resort thing for them. So if you know that about different riders, when a strong bias is in place, if the rail is determining the outcome of races or it's moving horses up 2, 3, 4 lengths, it's very advantageous to understand that rider X is going to take advantage of that, and rider Y is probably not going to take advantage of it. It just gives you an edge in your gambling.
Speaking of biases, how was your Breeders' Cup? I know we were lucky enough to talk about some of the races on the handicapping session we did. How did you do? in terms of some of your good opinions and bad opinions? Because I know you gave out a couple winners when we went mano a mano with Wahida and with Roy H. And how did the bias affect the way you played?
Well, it was, I think it was a pretty severe bias, Pete. And I don't have a lot of good report there. The professional horse player that wrote the book, still makes mistakes. So I think that's the news flash there. But it's a weird thing. I don't know that we really want to get into all this part, but I ended up doing okay for the 2 days. But what I did okay on were tracks other than the Breeders' Cup tracks. I had some winners. I cashed some tickets at the Cup, but I didn't make any money at the Cup. I had a couple of near misses. The thing that really cost me the most, that made there was a difference between a great Breeders' Cup and a minor loss Breeders' Cup was the Highland Reel not being able to get second in the race at Talismanic one. So that would have been a huge score for me. I just bought into, as I said on the webinar that we did, that Highland Reel would not be worse than second, that he was a total exacta key. And then I was lucky enough to press the horse, to find the right horse to put with him in Talismanic. And then, things didn't pan out. Highland Reel did not get second. So I'm going to touch on this real quickly too. This is something that we talk about in the book a little bit, that a professional horse player might do that sounds really weird. When on days like Breeders' Cup Day, I will also look at other tracks, because in my mind, every sharp player is looking at Breeders' Cup tracks. And, I want to take advantage of opinions I have there too. But, I was able to make a couple of nice hits. One of them specifically at Gulfstream West that day. And I felt like it paid, twice what it would normally pay. And I think the reason was there weren't as many sharks in the water at Gulfstream West as there normally would be. So, that's just a little sidebar as to, how varied my approach can be sometimes. But as far as the Breeders' Cup races, I had some good opinions. I didn't really make those pay off for me at the windows. And sometimes that's just the way the ball bounces. It was the repeating theme at the Breeders' Cup for me this year was a horse that one of either my second or third choice wins and pays a very nice price, and the horse that I have absolute faith in, that I've keyed first and second in nearly every ticket, runs third. That was a recurring theme for me.
I want to pause on the Breeders' Cup Day bias for a minute. You talk in the book about how biases today aren't as prevalent as they once were. Do you agree with the general consensus that rail situation on the 2 days of the Breeders' Cup was severe and was actually affecting the outcome of races?
Absolutely. I thought so. The part of, I thought it was very clear that the outside pass were better, especially the outside pass entering the stretch and in the stretch. Horses were getting very little done if they weren't trying to run on the outside pass late in those races, in the dirt races. The only hard part of defining the bias on the Breeders' Cup for me were the last two dirt races of the day on Saturday. It's hard for me to explain those races without thinking that the track evened out a little bit for the last two dirt races, which would have been the Juvenile and the Classic.
That's interesting. I mean, it did seem that Gunrunner was off the rail, but just the way that race sort of flowed 1, 2, 3 around the track, is that what made you think that?
Well, yeah, very legit fractions.
Yeah.
You don't see that type race, and it wasn't just that they ran 1, 2, 3. It was that it looked like to me they could have gone around again and they've been 1, 2, 3.
Right.
It was just it was a pure merry-go-round race. So it just did not look like the same track. And then when I add in that the previous race, the juvenile, all horses can get beat, but Bolt Doro underperforming, and just the general flow of that race didn't look anything like what we'd seen the first 2 days, in my opinion. So it's not definitive for me. I can't, I'm going to have to watch how horses run back to really know for sure. But my experience is kind of making me lean that way toward, it was a much fairer track for those 2 races. In like a lot of track bias situations, I can't tell you why. If I do happen to be right, I can't tell you why. Was it track maintenance? Was it weather? Was it tides? Was it what way? I don't know. But it seemed to me like those 2 races just visually look different.
Mike, we've talked about bias, and that's an exciting part about the book. Also, Pete and I often talk a lot about bet construction. We talk about DRF Ticket Maker. I know you were doing Ticket Maker on stone tablets back in the day. So talk a little bit about.
I came down the mountain with Ticket Maker.
Let the listeners in a little bit on what they can expect from a bet construction standpoint from the book.
Well, I every horse player has to know his weaknesses and his strengths. And I have long thought that if I have a strength, it is bet construction. And no human being on the planet has spent more time thinking about that than I have. For the last 30 years, every wager I make, every race I watch, it's the first question I ask myself is, did I bet that right? Did I use the right pool? Did I use the right approach? Did I weight the bet properly? Did I key the right horse? How was my structure? So, I've spent basically a lifetime at the track trying to refine those techniques. And I think when readers read that chapter in the book, a lot of people will almost think, gosh, you're almost in too much detail here. You're off in minutia when it comes to bet structure. But I think bet structure is so important. Number one, everybody, I think when you think about it, all regular horse players would probably agree with this comment. It's so much more common to find someone that's a really solid handicapper that doesn't know how to translate that into success at the windows than it is to find someone who even their kind of average opinion days where they don't split any atoms or pick any $40 horses, they seem to have a kind of a magic about themselves that they find a way to make it work at the windows. Well, I think that's all related to money management and bet structure. So I pay a lot of attention to it. I've really just spent a lot of time grinding over how we put that into the book. Pete was great about making it readable and, questioning me on why is this important and why is that not as important, and just Pete questioned me on a lot of things throughout the book, like why is this way? Why do you feel that way? That doesn't, that's kind of like not the way I would have pictured it going in. So, I think it's all laid out in the book to where I make my case for why I think this is the proper way to bet this situation, and why I think you use a different approach in another situation, and how you choose your pools, and how you choose your bet size. So a lot of thought's been given to all that. And I think, even if a reader doesn't use it all, there are going to be tidbits in there that I would hope would help every reader improve their betting game.
The eureka moment to me, Mike, and we're not going to, get into too much of the specifics here. It's all outlined in the book, which again can be purchased from the DRF store. You can tweet at me at Looms Boldly if you're looking to get a signed copy, or contact me privately. But the idea that you can construct bets where you have multiple goals that are being achieved at the same time. The concept of providing protection for yourself while at the same time maximizing your score. Before I worked with you on the book, I wouldn't have thought it was possible. How did the idea evolve? And then I want to get you to tell a quick story, and then we got to wrap in about 4 minutes. But I did want to ask that one follow-up for you on the bet construction. Where did you get the idea that you could do all that just in the way that you wager?
Just through trial and error, Pete. We're through, having a good opinion and seeing that opinion play out on the racetrack, and then not being rewarded at the window. That's maddening to any horse player. And I was just one of those horse players. So I tried to find ways to protect capital, and yet to be very aggressive in certain part of the bets at the same time. Well, that doesn't make sense when you just hear me say that, but it's all laid out in the book to where, I think there are techniques you can use that can accomplish both of those goals in a lot of races. Your basic opinions have to be right, but the goal of bet structure is to maximize your good opinions, is to make the most money we can make when we're exactly right, and also to get our money back or make a little bit when we just kind of graze it, when we're just kind of right. So that's the goal to me of bet structure, and that's the hard part. That's the people that grind over a race for hours will just run up and kind of do the bet on the fly. And I've never understood that. And I think there's so much potential for people to improve their games quickly by improving their bet structure. It's exciting for me to hopefully help with that.
All right. Well, we're going to have you back soon to go more into detail about all this stuff. The whole show, and we didn't even talk about ability figures, but we'll get there another time. I do want, before we go, though, Mike, you've had many entertaining close encounters with various celebrities within and without the horse racing industry. Tell us about that one encounter you had a few years ago up in the suites at Del Mar. I like this one.
Gotcha. I spend every summer, spend a little while in Del Mar, and the people take very good care of me. The bettor's concierge there is Betsy Christmas, very nice lady. And, she'll hook me up with a hotel reservation, and she always gives me great accommodations at Del Mar in a room on the 5th floor called the VIP Lounge. And I've sat in there for years. She always gives me the same table, and it's great. So I fly into San Diego to begin my trip, and I've communicated with Betsy. She knows I'm coming. She says, everything's good. You have your same table every day you're here. So I have trouble at the rental car place in San Diego. I'm running late. I'm frustrated. I'm hungry. I haven't anything to eat. So I was planning on going to the hotel, checking in, having some lunch there, and then walking over to the track. Now I'm running a little late, and I'm upset, frustrated. So I just drive directly to the track. As I get there, the gates are just opening. So I say, okay, good. I'll just take my form and stuff, and I'll go upstairs, and I'll get in the VIP lounge and I can take a breath. And they usually have like a can of mixed nuts up there. I'll eat a few of those nuts until the concessions open, and then I'll get something to eat. And, I can do some handicapping. I can finish some things up while I'm here. Well, when I walk into the VIP lounge, I'm the only one there, which is not unusual. Mostly people show up late right before the races. I'm the only one there. And instead of just a can of mixed nuts and a couple of bottles of water, one whole wall at the end of the room is a beautiful buffet. And it has tenderloin and, the big metal containers with the lid still on them with tenderloin and grilled chicken breast and all kinds of vegetables and a couple of beautiful salads and desserts. And I'm like, oh, man, this is perfect. They've really upgraded this room. This is fantastic. Wow, Betsy, this is, I got to tell Betsy how cool this is. So I load up 2 gigantic plates. Well, just as I'm starting to dig in and take like the second bite, this guy walks into the room and he gives me like a nasty look. So he walks to the other side of the room, and then another guy comes in behind him, and this dude must be like 260 pounds and about 6'4". And then a guy comes in behind him, and he's even bigger than that guy. So it's like four of them, file in behind the first guy. So, and they're all kind of like looking at me with attitude. And I'm like, I belong here. I don't know what your guys' problem is. I figured they were supposed to be in a dining room. Their dining room's adjacent to this lounge, and they just got lost and ended up in the same room. So in a couple of minutes, less than that really, the smaller guy that came in first says, "Excuse me, but I don't think you're supposed to be in here." And I said, "Well, I'm pretty sure I'm supposed to be in here." He says, "No, I don't think you are." And I said, "Well, yeah, I'm pretty sure I am." And he said, "Well, I think I should call Betsy Christmas and check." And I said, "I'll tell you what, I'll save you the trouble. I'll call Betsy Christmas." So I dial Betsy's number and step out in the hallway. And I'm sure Betsy's going to tell me how, hey, I'll have security come up. These guys are in the wrong room, whatever, because they're too big for me to ask them to leave. So as soon as Betsy picks up the phone, I tell her, "Hey, Betsy, there's a problem in the VIP lounge. There's some guys that think I'm not supposed to be here." And she goes, "Oh, my God, Drew Brees. We gave the room to Drew Brees and his teammates. And I forgot to tell you. I told everyone else, and I forgot to tell you." So she says, "Come to my office. I'll give you some seats. We'll put you up to someplace else." And I apologize, Mike. I'm so sorry. I said, "Betsy, don't worry about it." So I hang up and I walk back in, and I have to apologize to this guy. Now I look at him, and hell, he's Drew Brees. Obviously, I don't know why I didn't recognize him the first time. So I kind of mumble, "I'm sorry, Mr. Brees, can I leave a tip for the waitress, and on my way out, I apologize. You guys have a great day." And he's like, no money. And, "My linemen were impressed with your 2 plates of food over there. Go ahead and finish those before you leave." So that was my Drew Brees encounter. Is I busted up his buffet,
I hope you gave him a couple of winners.
He was actually very nice about it.
I hope you gave him a couple of winners at least for all that trouble you caused.
He didn't ask. He was just ready for me to. It was that situation. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here.
Fantastic stuff. All right, that is it. We are wrapped for this edition of the DRF Players Podcast. One more time, the book is Betting with an Edge. You can find it very soon, the electronic version on Amazon. You can buy it from the DRF store. You can tweet me at Looms Boldly or hit me up, podcast@drf.com, to potentially get a signed copy. We've got the Matt Bernier Show coming up next. This is Peter Thomas Fornatel. Thank you, Jonathan Kinchin. Thank you, Mike Maloney. Thank you, all of you, for listening. We'll be back on Friday. Keep it right here if you're listening live, and may you win all your photos.